He wins who waits. Once upon a time there reigned a king who had an only daughter. This girl had been spoiled by everyone from her birth, and besides being beautiful, was clever and quite willful. And when she grew old enough to be married, she refused to have anything to say to the prince whom her father favored, but declared that she would choose her own husband. By long experience, the king knew that once she had her mind made up, there was no use expecting her to change it. So he inquired meekly what she wished him to do.
"Summon all the young men in the kingdom to appear before me a month from today," answered the princess, "and the one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband."
"But, my dear," began the king in tones of dismay.
"The one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband,"
repeated the princess in a louder voice than before. And the king understood the signal, and with a sigh proceeded to do her bidding. The young men arrived, tall, short, fair, dark, rich, poor. They stood in rows in the great courtyard in front of the palace, and the princess, clad in robes of green, with a golden veil flowing behind her, passed before them all, holding the apple. Once or twice she stopped and hesitated, but in the end she always passed on, till she came to a youth near the end of the last row. There was nothing specially remarkable about him, the bystanders thought, nothing that was likely to take the girl's fancy. 100 others were handsomer, and all wore finer clothes, but he met the princess's eyes frankly and with a smile, and she smiled too, and held out the apple. "There's some mistake," cried the king, who had anxiously watched her progress and hoped that none of the candidates would please her. "It is impossible that she would wish to marry the son of a poor widow who is not a farthing in the world. Tell her I will not hear of it, and that she must go through the rows again and fix upon someone else." And the princess went through the rows a second time and a third time, and on each occasion she gave the apple to the widow's son. "Well, marry him if you will," exclaimed the angry king, "but at least you shall not stay here." And the princess answered nothing, but threw up her head, and taking the widow's son by the hand, they left the castle. That evening they were married, and after the ceremony went back to the house of the bridegroom's mother, which, in the eyes of the princess, did not look much bigger than a hen-coop. The old woman was not at all pleased when her son entered bringing his bride with him.
"As if we were not poor enough before," grumbled she. "I dare say that some fine lady can do nothing to earn her living."
But the princess stroked her arm and said softly,
"Do not be vexed, dear mother. I am a famous spinner, and I can sit at my wheel all day without breaking a thread."
And she kept her word. But in spite of her efforts with all three, they became poorer and poorer, and at the end of 6 months it was agreed that the husband should go to the neighboring town to get work. Here he met a merchant who was about to start a long journey with a train of camels laden with goods of all sorts, and needed a man to help him. The widow's son begged that he would take him as a servant, and to this the merchant assented, giving him a whole year's salary beforehand. The young man returned home with the news, and the next day bid farewell to his mother and his wife, who were very sad at the parting.
"Do not forget me while you are absent," whispered the princess as she flung her arms around his neck. "And as you pass by the well which lies near the city gate, stop and greet the old man you will find sitting there. Kiss his hand, and then ask him what counsel he can give you on your journey."
And the youth set out, and when he reached the well where the old man was sitting, he asked the question as his wife had bidden him.
"My son," replied the old man, "you have done well to come to me, and in return remember 3 things. She whom the heart loves is ever the more beautiful. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. And he wins who waits.
The young man thanked him and went on his way. Next morning early, the caravan set out, and before sunset it had arrived at the first halting place, around some wells where other company of merchants were already encamped. But no rain had fallen for a long while in that rocky country, and both men and beasts were parched with thirst. To be sure, there was another well about half a mile away, where there was always water, but to get to it, you had to be lowered deep down, and besides, no one who had ever descended that well had been known to come back. However, until they could store some water in their bags of goatskin, the caravans dared not go further into the desert, and on the night of the arrival of the widow's son and his master, the merchants had decided to offer a large reward to anyone who was brave enough to go down into the enchanted well and bring some up. Thus it happened at sunrise. The young man was aroused from his sleep by a herald making his round of the camp, proclaiming that every merchant present would give 1,000 piastres to the man who would risk his life to bring water for themselves and their camels. The youth hesitated for a little while when he heard of the proclamation. The story of the well had spread far and wide, and long ago had reached his ears. The danger was great, but he knew then, if he should come back alive, he would be the possessor of 80,000 piastres. He turned to the herald who was passing by the tent. He goes, "I will go," he said. "What madness!" cried his master, who happened to be standing near. "You are too young to throw your life away like that. Run after the herald and tell him you take back your offer." But the young man shook his head, and the merchant saw that it was useless to try to persuade him. "Well, it will be your own affair," he observed at last. "If you must go, you must. Only if you return, I will give you a camel's load of goods, and my best mule besides." And touching his turban as a token of farewell, he entered the tent. Hardly had he done so than a crowd of men were seen pouring out of the camp. "How can we thank you?" they exclaimed, pressing around the youth. "Our camels as well as ourselves are almost dead of thirst. See, here's a rope we have brought to let you down." "Well, come then," answered the youth, and they all set out. On reaching the well, the rope was knotted securely under his arms, and a big goatskin bottle was given to him, and he was lowered gently into the bottom of the pit. Here a clear stream was bubbling over rocks, and stooping down, he was about to drink, when a huge Arab appeared before him, saying in a loud voice, "Come with me!" The young man rose, never doubting that this was his last hour, but he could do nothing. So he followed the Arab into a brightly lighted hall on the further side of the little river. There his guide sat down, and drawing towards him 2 boys, one black and the other white, he said to the stranger, "I have a question to ask you. If you answer right, your life shall be spared. If not, your head will be forfeit, as the head of many others have been before you. Tell me, which of my 2 children do I think is the handsomer?" The question did not seem like a hard one, for the white boy was beautiful, a child as he ever seen, and the brother was even ugly for a negro. But just as the youth was going to speak, the old man's counsel flashed into the youth's mind, and he hastily repeated, "The one whom we love best is always the handsomest." "You have saved me!" cried the Arab, rising quickly from his seat and pressing the young man in his arms. "Ah, if you could only guess what I have suffered for the stupidity of all the people who have had put that question, and I was condemned by a wicked genius to remain here until it was answered. But what brought you to this place, and how can I reward you for what you have done for me?" "By helping me draw enough water for my caravan of 80 merchants and their camels, who are dying of want for it," replied the youth. "That is easily done," said the Arab. "Take these 3 apples. When you have filled your skin and are ready to be drawn up, lay one of them on the ground. Halfway to the earth, let another fall, and at the top drop the 3rd. If you follow my directions, no harm will happen to you. And take besides these 3 pomegranates, green, white, and red. One day you will find a use for them." The young man did as he was told, and stepped out on the rocky waste, where the merchants were anxiously awaiting him. Oh, how thirsty they were! But even after the camels had drunk, their skins seemed as full as ever. Full of gratitude for their deliverance, the merchants pressed the money into his hands, while his own master bade him choose what goods he liked, and a mule to carry them. So the widow's son was rich at last, and when the merchant had sold his merchandise and returned home to his native city, his servant hired a man by whom he sent the money and mule back to his wife. "I will send the pomegranates also," thought he, "for if I leave them in my turban, they may fall out." And he drew them out of his turban, but the fruit had vanished, and in their places were 3 precious stones, green, white, and red. For a long time he remained with the merchant, who gradually trusted him with all his business, and gave him a large share of the money he made. When his master died, the young man wished to return home, but the widow begged him to stay and help her, and one day he awoke with a start, to remember that 20 years had passed since he had gone away. "I want to see my wife," he said the next morning to his mistress. "If at any time I can be of use to you, send a messenger to me. Meanwhile, I've told his son what to do." And mounting a camel, he set off. Now, soon after he had taken service with the merchant, a little boy had been born to him, and both the princess and the old woman toiled hard all day to get the baby food and clothing. When the money and the pomegranates arrived, there was no need for them to work any more, and the princess saw at once that they were not fruit at all, but precious stones of great value. The old woman, however, not being accustomed, like her daughter-in-law, to the sight of jewels, only took them for common fruit, and wished to give them to the child to eat. She was very angry when the princess hastily took them from her and hid them in her sleeve, while she went to market and bought the 3 finest pomegranates she could find, which she handed the old woman for the little boy. Then she bought beautiful new clothes for all of them. And when they were dressed, they looked as fine as could be. Next, she took out one of the precious stones which her husband had sent her, and placed it in a small silver box. This she wrapped up in a handkerchief embroidered with gold, and filled the old woman's pockets with gold and silver pieces. "Go, dear mother," she said, "to the palace and present the jewel to the king, and if he asks you what he can give you in return, tell him you want a paper, with his seal attached, proclaiming that no one is to meddle with anything you may choose to do. Before you leave the palace, distribute the money amongst the servants." The old woman took the box and started for the palace. No one there had ever seen a ruby of such beauty, and the famous jeweler in town was summoned to declare its value. But all he could say was, "If a boy threw the stone into the air with all his might, and you could pile up gold as high as the flight of the stone, it would not be sufficient to pay for this ruby." At these words, the king's face fell. Having once seen a ruby, he could not bear to part with it, yet all the money in his treasury would not be enough to buy it. So for a little while he remained silent, wondering what offer he could make the old woman. And at last he said, "I cannot give you its worth in money. Is there anything you will take in exchange?" "A paper signed by your hand and sealed with your seal, proclaiming that I may do what I will, without let or hindrance," answered she promptly. And the king, delighted to have obtained what he had coveted at so small a cost, gave her the paper without delay. Then the old woman took her leave and returned home. The fame of this wonderful ruby soon spread far and wide, and envoys arrived at the little house to know if there were more stones to sell. Each king was so anxious to gain possession of a treasure that he bade his messenger outbid all the rest. And so the princess sold the 2 remaining stones for a sum of money so large that if the gold pieces had been spread out, they would have reached from here to the moon. The first thing she did was to build a palace by the side of the cottage, and it was raised on gold pillars, in which were set great diamonds, which blazed night and day. Of course, the news of this palace was the first thing that reached the king, her father, on his return from the wars, and he hurried to see it. In the doorway stood a young man of 20 who was his grandson, though neither of them knew it. And so pleased was the king with the appearance of the youth that he carried him back to his own palace and made him commander of the whole army. Not long after this, the widow's son returned to his native land. There, sure enough, was a tiny cottage where he had lived with his mother, but the gorgeous building beside it was quite new to him. What had become of his wife and his mother, and who could be dwelling in that other wonderful place? There were first thoughts that flashed through his mind, but not wishing to betray himself by asking any passing strangers, he climbed up into a tree that stood opposite the palace and just watched. By and by a lady came out and began to gather some of the roses and jessamine that hung on the porch. 20 years that had passed since he had last beheld her vanished in an instant, and he knew her to be his own wife, almost looking as young and beautiful as the day of their parting. He was about to jump down from the tree and hasten to her side when she was joined by a young man who placed his arm affectionately around her neck. Oh, at the sight, the angry husband drew his bow, but before he could let fly the arrow, the counsel of the wise men came back to him. "Patience is the first step on the road to happiness." And he laid it down again. At this moment the princess turned, and drawing her companion's head down to hers, kissed him on each cheek. And the second time blind rage filled the heart of the watcher, and he snatched up his bow from the branch where it hung, when words heard long since seemed to sound in his ears. "He wins who waits." And the bow dropped to his side. Then through the silent air came the sound of the youth's voice. "Mother, can you tell me nothing about father? Does he still live, and will he never return to us?" "Alas, my son, how can I answer you?" replied the lady. 20 years have passed since he left us to make his fortune, and that time only once have I heard aught from him. But what has brought him to your mind now?" "Because last night I dreamed that he was here," said the youth, "and then I remembered what I have long forgotten, that I had a father, even though his very history is strange to me. Now tell me, I pray you, all you can concerning him." And standing under the jessamine, the son learnt his father's history, and the man in the tree listened also. "Oh," exclaimed the youth when it ended, while he twisted his hands in pain, "I am General in Chief, and you are the king's daughter, and we have the most splendid palace in the whole world. And my father lives we know not where, and for all we can guess may be poor and miserable. Tomorrow I'll ask the king to give me soldiers, and I will seek him out in the whole earth until I find him." Then the man came down from the tree, and clasped his wife and son in his arms. All that night they talked, and when the sun rose, it found them still talking. But as soon as it was proper, he went to the palace to pay his homage to the king, and to inform him of all that had happened, and who they really were. The king was overjoyed to think that his daughter, whom he had long since forgotten and sorely missed, was living at his gates, and was, besides, the mother of the youth who was so dear to him. "It was written beforehand," cried the monarch. "You are my son-in-law before the world, and shall be king after me." And the man bowed his head. He had waited, and he had won.